Hi, I'm Nick Rodriguez with the Squid Ink service team. Today we're going to discuss the preventative maintenance routine for the CoPilot Max printhead. Before we get started with the preventative maintenance routine on your CoPilot Max printhead, it's going to be a good idea to go ahead and make sure that you drain all the fluids that you can out of the ink manifold and the print engine of your printhead, as to reduce the mess when we're doing the routine. We're going to be going in and replacing O-rings and the actual print engine, so we want to have a clean workspace if at all possible. What you're going to want is going to be a number 2 Phillips, a number 1 Phillips, a 4mm hex driver, a 2mm hex driver, some sort of a O-ring pick or a dental pick, a scraping tool to remove the gasket. This one has a razor blade on it, a 5mm nut driver, a T7 Torx driver, and a pair of side cutters. Outside of that, you're going to need the PM preventative maintenance part kit, which I'm sure we're going to be putting together a part number for all that, but that'll include your O-rings, your ink lines, your check tube, and a replacement print engine. So the first thing we're going to need to do when we're going to be implementing our PM schedule is to go ahead and remove the side covers on our CoPilot Max printhead. To do that, you're going to need your number 1 Phillips screwdriver. And we're going to remove the front cover first. Now when you're removing the front cover, you'll notice that on the bottom side of this PCB side cover, which is the one with the label on it, the bottom side of that front cover here is going to have a longer screw than the other screws on the front cover. There should be a part number listing on the work instructions for the preventative maintenance, but this is important to keep track of where this screw goes. We'll cover that when we reassemble the printhead. So once I've got these 2 covers or 2 screws removed from the cover, I'm going to flip my printhead and remove these 2. With the screws out of the way, we can go ahead and pull back our printhead cover, our front cover, and what we're looking at is next step is going to be to remove this gasket with our scraper tool. So once you have the cover off and put to the side, we're going to go ahead and take our scraper tool, and you're going to want to firmly press down but carefully go ahead and try to scrape as much of that O-ring material as you can out of the way. It may take a couple of passes. So move some of the material out of the way and go ahead and keep going. What you want to try to do is get as much of this other, residual out of there as well. So a couple more passes on that would help. We want to make sure that the new gasket that we install has an even ground and a clean surface to mount to. So I might take some alcohol here and just clean off this residual adhesive out of the way. So I've gone ahead and saturated my paper towel here with my cleaner. I'm just going to try to moisten this adhesive up a little bit so it can get out of the way. Now you may not be able to get all of it off with the paper towel, which is fine. You can go back ahead with your scraper tool and see if you can get more of it off. And there we go, we're getting a little bit there. And it doesn't have to be completely perfectly clean, but as clean as we can get it. I think we'll start there. So the next step here is to go ahead and take your replacement gasket and get that ready to be installed. So what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to peel this back film off the gasket itself. And once you do that, it's going to reveal the adhesive backing on this gasket. We're going to want to carefully install it so that it wraps around the orifice or the nozzle orifice there, the nozzle channel. So I'm going to peel it here from the back. And then I'm going to get it situated so that I can mount it. So I like to start at the bottom and get that lined up. As best as you can. Watch that. Now what you want to avoid is overlapping that orifice channel. Now that doesn't look perfect, but it will wrap around the edges of that print engine once it gets mounted in. So I'm just pressing down, making sure we've got a good, nice seat on there. So after you went ahead and installed that gasket, you want to flip it over and just examine this nozzle channel. Make sure you're not overlapping that gasket material in the opening here, which looks like we should be pretty good here. So I'm going to go ahead and take this nozzle cover and I'm going to put that off to the side so we can complete the rest of our PM schedule. So now that we've got our nozzle cover off and the new gasket installed, we put that to the side. We're going to go ahead and complete the rest of the routine, but we still need to remove the screws from our side covers. Now, I like to start with the PCV side cover. As I mentioned before, I'm going to hear me calling it the PCV side cover, but it's going to be the cover that has the Max logo or descriptor on it here, okay? So what we're going to do is remove the 3 screws here, and then the 4th and final screw right here at the back. So those screws out of the way, we'll be able to take this cover right off. Now one of the things that you'll see here again is different size screws. It's important to know the placement of where those screws go. This back corner screw here is going to be a little bit smaller than these 2 screws, and I'll show you what this one looks like real quick. Okay, so 2 long screws here in the middle, short screw here, and there's going to be a short screw here on the side as well that we got to remove before we can take this cover off. Our 4th and final screw is right here, so we're going to go ahead and take that off. That's located right above that drain tube port. So again, to point that out, that's a little bit shorter screw than the 2 screws we saw on the side. Okay, so we're going to get that out of the way. With all the screws removed, we're going to go ahead and take our side cover off and put it to the side. So here you'll see the actual insides of our print head. What our target here is going to be this print engine, and also we're going to go in the back side and remove the side cover so that we can get at the ink manifold itself. But I just wanted to point it out. The things that we'll be changing here on this side will be this ink line, this print engine, and this check tube that we see here with the black tubing. We'll be replacing that as well while we complete this. So before we get to that, I'm going to go ahead and remove the ink manifold side cover. So the next step here in our process to remove this ink manifold side cover, what we're going to do that is remove the 1, 2, or 3 screws here located there, and they're a little bit different than the other black screws that we've been dealing with, and I'll show you what that looks like here in a second. So these screws have a little bit more of an aggressive thread than the other more finer threads on the screws here. Again, we'll have this listed off for you. I'll remove that out of the way and I'll continue to remove the other screws here. With the 3 screws here removed, I'm going to go ahead and just lift up my ink manifold side cover out of the way and put that off to the side. Now we should be able to see the entire ink manifold itself, which will allow us to gain access to that. Now we're going to move on to the next step. With the side cover removed here, I'm going to go ahead and flip my print head back to this side, because what we need to do now is go ahead and remove the check tube from the print engine and the ink line going to the print engine. What I'm going to do to achieve that is use my side cutters and go ahead and try to get a snip of the side of the tube here. I want to go carefully as to not pinch the barb itself underneath it, but once you get enough cut, it should be able to pull away like so. We're going to repeat that down here on the ink line as well. I'm going to take my side cutters and go ahead and pinch that tube and kind of peel away if you can a little bit. Should be enough there, and yep, there we go. So we've got our check tube and our ink line removed. The next step here will be to disconnect our internal data cable. To remove this cable, what we're going to need to do is pinch these latches and pull them up like that to release, and you'll see, and you should feel that as well, a noticeable release. And go ahead and pull that latch out of the way, just like that. And we're going to have that off to the side. Once we have everything disconnected from the print engine, we're going to want to go ahead and dismount the print engine and put that to the side. But in order to get there, we're going to need to loosen up these or remove these 3 frame screws here so that we can loosen up the connection between the aluminum frame and this plastic chassis. So with my number 2 Phillips, I'm going to go ahead, kind of rotate it there a little bit, but I'm going to go ahead and start removing these frame screws. Now, removing the frame screws will just give you enough play so that we can access the top bolt on our print engine. And I'll show you what I mean when we get to that real quick here. The frame screws out of the way, we're going to go ahead and flip our print head in this manner. And what you can see now, you see that we've got a little bit more play here. I can push this down so I can access this bolt. That's what we're looking for right there. So using my number 4 hex driver, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start removing these 2 bolts here. Now, one thing I want to point out about these 2 bolts is you'll notice that on the top side of the print engine, which is where this curve is, you'll see this spacer washer in between the print engine and the aluminum frame. We want to keep note of that position because when we reinstall it, we want to make sure that spacer washer ends up in that same place. So I'm going to go ahead and start with my bottom bolt here. I'm going to put in my number 4, I'll loosen that up. Go ahead and put that to the side. And now at the top, I'm going to use my hand and kind of nudge it down now that we've got that frame screw out of the way. And get my hex in there and break that bolt loose. And go ahead and loosen that one up. So once you have that bolt loose, you can kind of finagle it so that you can keep that washer still on the bolt. And that way you can put that to the side when you're done. So now with the print engine loose, we've got nothing holding it in place. We can go ahead and take that and remove it out completely. I'm gonna flip this over here so you guys can take a look at it. But what we want to capture here is going to be the information on this side of the print engine. Now this information is going to only be accessible when you remove the print engine because it's down towards the ink manifold when it's installed in the print head. So there's going to be a spreadsheet that you should have access to, and we're going to want to document the number, this number here on the top of the print engine that we removed. You're also going to, at the end of this, when we install the new manifold or print engine, is to document the new print engine serial number so that we can keep track of when and where and which ones were installed. Now that I've removed my print engine, I put that off to the side. The next step is to go ahead and loosen up these 4 screws here that mount the ink manifold to the frame. So again, using your number 2 Phillips, we're just going to go ahead and start removing these screws. Now, the reason we're going to remove these screws is because we want to have access to that ink manifold, specifically that ink inlet port that we'll show you once we get it out here. So you'll see that the manifold's beginning to loosen up. That's fine. It should just lay flat once you have all the screws out. So once we have those screws there and the manifold's loose, we're going to go ahead and carefully flip the print head over so that we have access to this manifold. So what we're going to do is I like to grab the manifold with my thumb and kind of clench on the frame at the same time. We're going to go ahead and grab that and lift it up. And that's what we want to work with here. We're going to need to pull this ink manifold and so that we have access to this. So the best way here for you to do that is to kind of put a little bit of pressure on the frame there so that you can remove the ink port out of the way so that it doesn't get caught there. And this is what we want. We want to have access to this ink port. Now, a good way to give you a little bit more access here would be to go ahead and pull up the vacuum line here. There we go. So with the ink manifold loosened up and separated from the frame, the next step that we're going to want to do here is we're going to want to cut the ink line going to this manifold outlet barb. And again, we're going to use our side cutters. Just try to get your side cutters at an angle here where you can pinch the edge of that barb, cut and peel that tubing away, and do your best to pull that up. There we go. We can go ahead and discard that spent tubing. Once the tubing's out of the way, now we can flip it back on its side. The rest of the PM is going to involve replacing the O-rings and the screen filter located on and behind this ink port. So that's where we're going to spend the remainder of the time here when we replace parts. All right. So what we're going to do here is, in order to get past this, we're going to have to remove all 8 of these bolts that are holding, or screws that are holding this ink port down to the manifold. I'm going to start with the outside ones, which are just your number 1 Phillips. Go ahead and just remove those screws and put them off to the side. With the Phillips head screws out of the way, we're going to take our 2mm hex driver and we're going to remove the inside screws that hold that ink port down as well. Now that our screws are off from the ink port, we can go ahead and just remove that by lifting up. What you should see here is a couple of yellow EPDM O-rings. They may be discolored if this is a used system. Obviously this one is pretty clean, so I can tell exactly what I'm looking at. But we're going to be replacing those O-rings, the screen filters that are located right behind those O-rings. We're also going to be replacing the O-ring on the ink nipple here, and the 2 Buna O-rings that are located behind it. So basically any O-ring that's going to be connecting the ink cartridge to our manifold is going to be replaced. So that's our first step. We're going to go ahead and do the replacement on the ink port, and then we'll move on to the manifold. So as you can see, I've got my ink port here isolated by itself. I also have my replacement O-rings to the side here so that I know which ones I've got. I'm gonna start here with my inlet port here, and I'm gonna use my pick tool. I'm just gonna hold my port here. I'm gonna use my pick tool and just try to grab onto it. Slide under it and try to work its way out, just like that. Okay, put that off to the side. You can discard those O-rings once they're done. Now we're gonna go ahead and move on to the back Buna ports. This one, I'm gonna pick at it and go ahead and remove it. And the same thing, this one. All right, now we want to go ahead and clean this port up a little bit so that it's not full of fluids here. We'll clean up the front side, and then we'll install our new O-rings. With the old O-rings removed, we'll go ahead and clean the ink port from any residue of fluid or cleaner or ink. And what you're going to want to do is use a lint-free wipe so that we don't introduce any contaminants, any lint to the system when we put it together. So I'm going to go ahead and just wipe as much of it as I can down. I'm going to focus really on where the O-rings are going to be installed so that there's nothing there that can damage or mess with the new O-rings. Well, that looks pretty clean to me. I'm going to go ahead and get ready to put in my O-rings now. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to put in my Calraz O-ring that's located on that ink nipple. What you do here is I like to start by just kind of lining it up, and this might be a little difficult to see, but I like to line it up and kind of use my thumbs to press down and stretch it over that. Until it falls into place. Okay, I just want to check it, make sure it's not spun up or anything like that. If it is spun up, I could take this pick and kind of make sure it straightens out a little bit. So this is a very important O-ring because this is where your ink cartridge and your ink manifold marry. So if this is out of whack, or if this is damaged, or if it's not installed correctly, you're going to get a leaking printhead. We don't want that. The next step is to go ahead and install our Buna O-rings here, which is relatively easy here. So take one of the O-rings and just line it up. And then I like to take the pick tool and just push it down and seat it. Make sure it's in that groove that's made for the O-ring itself. We don't want it to pinch on the sides here or anything like that, otherwise it'll make the O-ring useless. I'll go ahead and install the second one. Again, with the pick tool, I like to kind of push it down at the back side. Make sure it's all properly seated. And yeah, I want to make sure it's all in that groove, and it won't be overlapping on anything here. So our ink port here is done. We can go ahead and put that to the side and start working on the ink manifold itself. With our ink port completed, we're going to move on to our manifold. And again, you can see there's a little bit of residue here, so I'm going to grab my lint-free wipe and just kind of clean this area off. Now it's important to get as much of that out of the way as possible. When we remove these screen filters, we're going to be looking right at our check valves, and we don't want any lint or anything like that or debris falling into our check valve and possibly compromising that action. So we're going to go ahead and just be careful with removing our EPDM yellow O-rings. Put them to the side. And then our screen filter, we use our pick tool and kind of lift it up a little, and you can grab it out of the way. Same with the other side. Grab it out of the way. Now, anything that we took out of here, we can go ahead and just discard those. We don't need to keep that around. Next step is to go ahead and install our new screen filters. So So I'm gonna go ahead. Now these screen filters, they're not directional. So you'll see that, of course, they're flat, meaning they got two sides. Doesn't matter which side they end up on, okay? We just want them in there. So we wanna make sure they're flat and in there like that, okay? Next step is we put our new spacer EPDM O-rings. Make sure those are in here. Just like so. Take another clean here before we reinstall our ink port. Now that all of our O-rings and screen filters have been replaced, it's time to reinstall our ink port. What I want to point out here is you'll see this plug on this side here. It should be next to this plate, and this plug should be pointing upwards towards the stepper motors here. So just an important side note to keep in mind: when we install it, we want that to the up. We don't want it to the bottom side of the manifold here. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go ahead and install the 4 screws in the middle, and we'll go out to the screws on the side. I like to get them started on the corners here. Now I'm just going to get everything started first. Once I get everything in, then I'll go ahead and tighten these middle screws down. There we go. Now we'll go ahead and tighten it down here. Nice and snug. We don't have to go too crazy, but you want it snug. We're trying to make a seal here, so there and there. Now I can go ahead and install the remaining 4 screws on the edges. Now these screws should be easy to identify. They're going to be the metallic, the only long metallic screws that we're using in this entire print head here. So again, there should be a list listing all the different screws that are used and a description of them. So if you do need spares, we can get them to you. There, screws are tightened down. I'm just going to clean this off a little bit, make sure everything looks good. And yeah, next step is to go ahead and install our ink line. So once we've got our ink port all taken care of, new filters, new O-rings, the next step is to go ahead and install a new ink line on this barb. As you can see, there's a lot of tight space here, so what we're going to want to do is remove one of these solenoids here. What that's going to require is a Torx to remove the 2 screws that hold the solenoid here, so we can get enough space to access that ink barb. So I'm going to take my T7 Torx bit here, and I'm going to remove and loosen up these screws here that hold that first solenoid in place. Looks like we're loose there. I'm going to travel to the back side here and do the same thing. Get that loosened up, and once that's loosened, we'll go ahead and pull it out of the way here. Good time to go ahead and clean up this surface as well. So now that I have the solenoid out of the way, I've got access to my barb. I'm going to take my new replacement ink line here, and I'm going to flare out the end to kind of ease the installation over that barb. So using my number 2 Phillips, I'm going to go ahead and take that and just flare that lightly. You spin it in there so that we give ourselves a little bit of a flared end. Then what I'm going to do is work the tubing down. What we're trying to do is get it down as far as you can past the barb, like that, without kinking or damaging any of the tubing there. So with the ink line mounted, we're going to go ahead and reinstall our solenoid. I'm going to take your T7 again and just line up your screws And I like to mount the one side, and then we'll go ahead and start the other side. And again, we just need these to be snug, not too crazy over tight, so we don't want to damage the solenoid itself. Once you get it mounted to the point where you get a little bit of resistance, go ahead and stop. So we've got our solenoid back installed, ink line installed. We're going to go ahead and start remounting our ink manifold to our printhead housing. Before we do that, we're going to need to reconnect our vacuum line here to our board. So I'm going to go ahead and take my vacuum line that was on my board. I'm going to plug it right there. And we're going to go ahead, and what we're going to end up doing is getting this to remount here. So now that it's loose from the frame, you can kind of move the frame a little bit so that you can squeeze the manifold in place. That's what we're looking for right there. With the manifold in place on the frame here, we're going to go ahead and flip the printhead on its side so we can mount the bottom screws and secure the manifold to the printhead frame here. So I like to grab that, and we're going to go ahead and flip it on its back here, like so. What you may need to do is do a little bit of lining up of the portholes here and the actual threads. So I'll start at one of the corners. If I can see it, there we go. Just like that. And with my number 2, go ahead and secure that in place. There we go. We'll go ahead and finish the installation of the rest of the manifold mounting screws. And good. Once we've got the ink manifold mounted, and I know we talked about installing that vacuum line, but I wanted to point out what we've got here. We've got a used vacuum line that's got a little bit of debris in it right here that you can see. And you've got a new vacuum line here that has nothing in it. Now, what you want in normal operation is there should not be anything inside of this vacuum line. If there's anything in there that's going to impede the process of it checking that vacuum, both internal in the manifold and external in ambient. This is very important for maintaining prime and keeping the system running regularly. So if you do see anything here that looks like it's solid and blocking the pathway of the tube, it's a good idea to go ahead and get a replacement. We'll get that part number included on the SOP there. So since I had a partially blocked vacuum line, I'm going to head and install my new vacuum line, and we're going to go ahead and install that here in this barb to the manifold like so. And then the other end of that is going to go onto this main board here, and we're going to use this bottom barb on the vacuum sensor of this sensor here. You'll see there's 2. The bottom one actually is going to calculate the vacuum setting of the manifold. We'll push that all the way in. And the top one is going to base that and cross-reference that with ambient. So that's perfect. The next step we're going to do after we've got our clean vacuum line installed is we're going to want to take and remove our old check tube out of the way. So again, I'm going to use my side cutters, and I'm going to remove it from this outlet port here. Just going to cut a little bit from the edge. And pull that off to the side. So with the check tube out of the way, the next step is to make sure that our ink line is plumbed and ready to be installed on the print engine. So we're going to go ahead and take our ink line and pull it through the bottom side of this vacuum line. The end result is to be plugged into the bottom of the print engine right around here. So we want to make sure it can reach that and it's not going to be kinked or overlapping anything that's needed here. So once we have that, let's go ahead and take a look at our check tubes and compare the two. So in your PM kit, you're going to receive a new check tube as well. This is another very important piece to pay attention to. We want to make sure that we have the orientation correct. As you can see from the old tube, we've got a certain way that it bends. One side going to the outlet and one side going to the print engine. When we install the new one, we're going to want to make sure we follow that pathway. Otherwise, it's going to not allow us to have the proper flow. So one helpful tip is that the tubes should have this indicator on them, indicating which way goes towards the print engine. We're going to go ahead and install this line real quick here and get that print engine installed right after. So with the old one removed, I've got my dot pointing towards the print engine. I'm going to go ahead and mount this strictly on or right onto this barb here. Now this one we don't need to remount to flare up. It should install pretty simply. So just needs a little bit of force. I'm going to slide it all the way up to the back of that nut. So at this point we've got everything, all the tubing replaced and installed and ready. We're going to want to now replace and install our print engine. So what we've got what we've got in front of us right now is our replacement print engine. Now what you're seeing here is the print engine removed from all the packaging inside of the box. What we're going to do is we're going to get the ink lines installed, and we're going to keep the protective cover on so that we can use that and not damage any of the nozzles. At this point, before you install this new print engine, you're going to want to make sure that you document this number from the replacement print engine on the spreadsheet that you have for keeping track of the PM schedule. So we want to know which ones we took out and which ones we're putting in. Go ahead and mark that in there. You'll see that the side with the serial number, we're going to want that facing down towards the ink manifold. What we're going to do is we're going to first attach the our check tube to our top barb, and then we're going to attach our ink line to our bottom barb. This is much easier with the print engine out and not mounted on the frame. It'll give you a little bit more access. So the first thing we're going to want to do is just remove this protective barb cover for the top, and we're going to take our check tube and we're just going to go ahead and slide it on here. And again, it's going to take a little bit of force, but you don't want to get it. The primary thing is to get it over all three barbs. You're going to see that on the check tube, it's a little bit easier to do that. On the bottom here, it's going to be a little bit more difficult, but we can get it done. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and, just like we did when we mounted the ink line to the manifold, I'm going to take my number 2 Phillips, and I'm going to flare this just slightly. This will help us install this here. And then I'm going to remove my protective cover, my print engine, grab my ink line, and you're going to want to make sure the ink line is actually plumbed underneath the check tube here. And we're going to go ahead and start working its way on the barbs. Again, it's more important that it goes over all three barbs. If you can get it all the way to the end, even better. So next is to go ahead and mount our print engine to our frame. So we're going to first have to remove our cover. Once we remove that cover, we're going to want to make sure that we're being very careful with that nozzle strip here. We want to try to limit any contact with this nozzle strip there, as any damage to the orifice can cause print quality issues. We don't want that. So I'm going to line up my print engine, and I'm going to start with the bottom one so that it holds it in place. Just line it up by hand. We want that hold in there. Now we're going to go ahead and start the top. Again, we're going to use loosen up that frame from the top. I'm gonna go ahead and slide my bolt through. And then again, we've got our spacer washer. So I'm gonna install that spacer washer there. So it's in between the print engine and the frame. Once we're all lined up, we'll go ahead and start fastening that down. There we go. Again, we want it to be snug. So, there, we're good there. And now tighten down, finish the bottom. With the print engine already mounted and installed, our ink lines installed, now it's time to reconnect our internal data cable. So I'm gonna go ahead and push my check tube here. We're just going to want to let it sit in the recess in between the standoff for installation and this connector, like that. So once you have it set up like that, then you can go ahead and just push from the back. Push it forward towards the face of the print engine. You should feel these tabs lock up and go flat like this. Once they're out, that's open and unlocked. Once they're in and installed correctly, they should flatten out just like that. And you want to make sure there's an even seat here. Okay, once that's installed, then we can go ahead and seat our check tube so that it's not going to get in the way of anything that we're mounting here. Our print engine's installed, data cables are all on. We're gonna go ahead and now refasten our aluminum frame to the plastic chassis here with these 3 frame screws. Using your number 2 Phillips, we'll go ahead and start that process. With that installed, we're going to move on to mounting and reinstalling the PCV cover. Okay. One of the things I'll point out is that there are a few tabs on these covers that help you line up the cover to the chassis itself. So on this PCV side, there's only one here at the front, which will line up to this print engine port over here. So that's to help make an even seat on when you install it. So when we lay this down on it, we just want to make sure that that post goes right into that mounting hole. With that in place, we'll go ahead and tighten up the 2 screws that go here. We can switch to our number 1 Phillips for this. I like to get these 2 started. Now we'll mount the back 2. Got the shorter of these screws mounting to this upper corner. And the final screw will be back here for this side cover. Like so. We'll go ahead and flip this printhead over and start with the ink manifold side. So again, the ink manifold cover is going to have a couple of post locations that you can use to line up on your printhead. So be mindful of that, as to not bend those posts when you're installing. Start at the bottom and work your way up to the top. Make sure everything lines up. With the posts installed, we'll go ahead and start our 3 screws. We'll start at the top here. There. These screws you don't have to go all that tight with. You just want to go until they're snug again. You don't want to over tighten these. Threads are going into plastic here, so we don't want to strip that chassis. All right, once they're on snugly like that, we can move on to installing our print head or our nozzle cover. And remember that we've already installed our gasket. So with the print head sitting just the way it is, we're just going to slide it on. Be mindful of the bottom. And slide that into place. The ink manifold side has 2 of these smaller metallic screws for the cover, so we'll install those first. I'll start at the bottom. Just get that started, and then we'll work our way to the top here. There and there. All right, now they're started. They're not tightened yet because we're going to go over to the back side. We'll flip the print head over, and I'll turn the head this way. So again, this bottom port here is what's going to take the longer of the 2 screws here. We've got that screw and this screw on top. So I'm just going to line it up here. And I'm going to start with this bottom screw at the bottom here. Like that. Now that screw is important as it provides the proper tension on the gasket that we installed here so that it rests right up against the print engine itself. You know, that gasket is there to prevent any fluids from leaking back into the print head. So that's why it's important that you have this installed properly. Once you get this side snug and good, just go ahead and make sure that all the screws are snug in place. There and there. So now our print head is completely reassembled. We can go on to the next phase. Once you've completed reassembling your print head, it's now time to go ahead and move on to the next phase, which would be to go ahead and commission and test that print head. Now, if you're going to commission it, I would recommend you commissioning it online. If you need steps or guidance on how to properly commission the print head, please reference our YouTube channel, which you'll find a Max and 512i commissioning video that covers all the steps you need to go ahead and do that properly. My name is Nick Rodriguez. Thank you for watching our video. I hope you found it useful. If you want to find any other videos, go ahead and find us on YouTube or elsewhere on the web.